Back in 1985, Japan had become something incredible. From the ruins of World War II, it had transformed into an industrial powerhouse that made America genuinely nervous. Japanese cars ruled American highways, Sony Walkmans were everywhere, and Japanese steel was literally building American cities. But this success created a massive problem. By 1984, America was hemorrhaging money to Japan through trade deficits worth $37 billion. American factories were shutting down, workers were losing jobs, and angry voters wanted someone to blame. Politicians pointed straight at Tokyo, accusing Japan of keeping their currency artificially cheap to flood global markets with underpriced exports. The solution came wrapped in diplomatic language, but it was essentially an ultimatum. On September 22, 1985, finance ministers from the world's 5 most powerful economies met secretly at the Plaza Hotel in New York. What they agreed to that day would reshape global finance forever. They called it the Plaza Accord, and they sold it as a way to fix trade imbalances for everyone's benefit. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, deliberately weakened the US dollar against other major currencies, especially the Japanese yen and German Deutschmark. America needed their exports to become competitive again, and they convinced their allies this would create a win-win situation. Here's how the logic was supposed to work. A stronger yen would make Japanese consumers richer overnight, able to afford more American goods. Meanwhile, Japanese exports would become more expensive, reducing America's trade deficit. Everyone walks away happy, right? Japan's finance minister, Noboru Takeshita, signed eagerly. After all, who wouldn't want their currency to become more valuable? It seemed like free money for every Japanese citizen. But this was the beginning of one of the most spectacular economic disasters in modern history. To understand what happened next, you need to grasp a fundamental truth about exchange rates. Currency values aren't just numbers on a screen. They're the foundation of every economic decision a country makes. When you artificially manipulate these rates, you're essentially rewiring how an entire economy thinks and behaves. The yen's rise was immediate and brutal. Within just 2 years, it had strengthened by over 50% against the dollar. Imagine if your salary suddenly became worth 50% more when buying foreign goods, but everything you produce for export became 50% more expensive for foreign buyers. That's exactly what happened to Japan. For Japanese exporters, this was catastrophic. Toyota cars that American dealers could buy for the equivalent of $20,000 in 1985 suddenly cost $30,000 in 1987. Sony Electronics went from competitive to luxury priced overnight. Companies that had built their entire business model around export efficiency watched their profit margins evaporate. But here's where the story takes its most dangerous turn. Instead of accepting that the export boom needed to wind down naturally, Japanese policymakers panicked. They saw unemployment rising, corporate profits collapsing, and recession looming. So they made a choice that would haunt Japan for decades. They decided to fight economic reality with monetary policy. The Bank of Japan began aggressively cutting interest rates. The official rate plummeted from 5% in 1985 to just 2.5% by 1987. Money became almost free to borrow, and the government actively encouraged everyone to spend and invest to keep growth alive. This reveals a crucial principle that applies to every modern economy. When governments can't solve structural problems through productivity and innovation, they almost always try to solve them through cheap money. It's happening right now in economies around the world. What happened when money became practically free was something nobody in that Plaza Hotel meeting room had anticipated. With ultra-low interest rates and official encouragement to spend, Japanese money began flooding into the only assets that couldn't be moved overseas: domestic real estate and stocks. The psychology behind this shift was perfectly logical at the individual level, which made it incredibly dangerous at the national level. If you're a Japanese company executive in 1987, you're thinking, our export business is dying, but we can borrow money at 2.5% and buy property that's appreciating at 20% annually. That's easy math. If you're an ordinary Japanese citizen watching your neighbor get rich from property speculation, While your savings account pays almost nothing, you start thinking maybe you should join the party too. This is how rational individuals can create irrational bubbles. Japanese banks, suddenly competing in a deregulated environment with excess liquidity, began throwing money at any project that promised returns. The lending standards that had made Japanese banking famous for its conservatism evaporated almost overnight. If you had collateral, especially real estate collateral, you could borrow enormous sums at incredibly low rates. Corporate Japan abandoned its traditional focus on manufacturing excellence and productive investment. Instead, companies began speculating in property and stocks. Major corporations started acting more like hedge funds than industrial enterprises. Mitsubishi, Toyota, Sony, these weren't just making cars and electronics anymore. They were essentially running massive speculation operations on the side. The numbers became absolutely surreal. Between 1985 and 1989, the Nikkei stock index rocketed from 12,000 to nearly 39,000 points. That's a 225% increase in just 4 years. For context, if the S&P 500 did that today, it would hit about 16,000 points. Real estate prices in Tokyo entered a realm that defied all logic. The land under the Imperial Palace became theoretically worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. A single square meter of prime Tokyo real estate was trading for prices equivalent to a luxury home in most American cities. By 1988, something remarkable was happening in Japan. The country was experiencing what economists call wealth effects on a scale never seen before. When your house is worth 3 times what you paid for it, when your stock portfolio is generating returns that dwarf your salary, when everyone around you is getting rich from investments rather than work, the entire social fabric begins to change. Japanese companies started buying trophy assets overseas with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They purchased Rockefeller Center for $1.4 billion, Pebble Beach golf links for $841 million, and Columbia Pictures for $3.4 billion. These weren't strategic acquisitions based on careful analysis. They were expressions of a national psychology that had convinced itself that Japanese wealth was infinite. Golf club memberships in Japan were selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Art auctions became battlefields where Japanese buyers set record after record, not necessarily because they loved Van Gogh, but because everything seemed like a good investment in a world where asset prices only went up. The banking sector had become completely detached from its traditional role. Instead of carefully evaluating creditworthiness and funding productive enterprises, banks were essentially acting as enablers for a national gambling addiction. They were lending against collateral that was inflating in value every month, creating a feedback loop where rising asset prices justified more lending, which drove asset prices even higher. Here's a crucial concept that applies to every asset bubble in history. When the value of collateral rises faster than the income it generates, you're living in a fantasy world. A Tokyo office building might be worth $50 million on paper, but if it only generates $500,000 in annual rental income, something is fundamentally wrong. The same principle applies to any overvalued asset, whether it's tech stocks in 2000 or housing in 2006. By late 1989, even the most optimistic policymakers at the Bank of Japan could see that the bubble had become a threat to Japan's long-term economic health. Inflation was starting to creep up, and the speculative frenzy was pulling resources away from productive uses across the entire economy. They began raising interest rates, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. The official rate climbed from 2.5% to 6% by 1990. The idea was to engineer a soft landing that would cool speculation without destroying the wealth that had been created. But bubbles don't deflate gradually. They pop. And when they pop, the destruction is proportional to the illusion that preceded it. The Nikkei began falling in January 1990. At first, investors called it a healthy correction, a temporary setback before the next leg up, but the selling accelerated with a viciousness that shocked everyone. By October 1990, the index had lost 40% of its value. By 1992, it had fallen to under 15,000 points, destroying more than half the wealth that had seemed so real just 3 years earlier. Real estate followed the same trajectory. Commercial property prices in Tokyo fell by 70% over the next decade. Residential property lost half its value. The wealth that had seemed so permanent, so solidly based on the value of Japanese land and companies, simply evaporated. The human cost was devastating in ways that pure economic statistics couldn't capture. Companies that had borrowed against their inflated assets suddenly found themselves technically bankrupt. Banks faced waves of bad debts that threatened the entire financial system. Unemployment, virtually unknown during the bubble years, began rising relentlessly. But perhaps the deepest damage was psychological. Japan had built its post-war identity around continuous growth, around the belief that hard work and smart investment would always be rewarded. The bubble's collapse shattered that faith completely. What happened to Japan wasn't unique. It was a textbook example of what economists call a boom-bust cycle driven by monetary policy mistakes. The same pattern has repeated throughout history, and it's happening right now in economies around the world. The Plaza Accord playbook became the standard template for international financial pressure. We saw it again during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, when countries were forced to accept IMF conditions that restructured their entire economies. We saw it in the 2010 European debt crisis, when Greece and other nations had to accept external control over their fiscal policies. Today, the same pressures are being applied to China. Trade tensions, currency manipulation accusations, and demands for rebalancing all echo the language used against Japan in the 1980s. The tools have evolved, but the fundamental strategy remains the same. Use international cooperation as cover for economic pressure that serves the dominant power's interests. Here's what this means for you personally. When central banks promise that their interventions will create prosperity, remember Tokyo in 1989. When politicians insist that this time is different, remember that Japan's lost decades started with identical promises. When asset prices reach levels that seem to defy gravity, remember that the Imperial Palace was once theoretically worth more than California. The Federal Reserve's policies over the past 15 years follow the exact same script: ultra-low interest rates, quantitative easing, and repeated promises of soft landings. Housing prices in major American cities now routinely cost 10 or 15 times median local incomes, just like Tokyo real estate in the late 1980s. Stock market valuations have reached levels that would have seemed impossible just a decade ago. Japan's tragedy wasn't just the economic collapse, it was the destruction of a generation's faith in the future. Even today, more than 30 years later, Japan has never fully recovered the dynamism and confidence it had before the bubble burst. Savings rates remain high as consumers refuse to believe in sustained growth. Companies hoard cash instead of investing aggressively. An entire society learned that decades of careful progress can be wiped out by monetary policy experiments. The lesson is brutal but essential. Financial engineering cannot replace economic fundamentals. Currency manipulation creates temporary advantages at the cost of long-term stability. And when governments promise to manage the impossible, ordinary people always pay the price. The Plaza Accord proved that economic sovereignty can be negotiated away in luxury hotel conferences, and that international cooperation often means manipulation disguised as diplomacy. The deal that made Japan rich was the same deal that condemned it to decades of stagnation. And somewhere in the world today, another country is probably signing its own version, convinced that this time the outcome will be different. If this helped you understand how international finance really works, hit subscribe. These patterns repeat constantly, and I'll show you where to spot them next.